Hello, everybody. Thank you for this invitation to be part of the symposium in Bratislava, even though I cannot be there with you physically. Unfortunately, due to a lockdown in Austria, I was not able to travel to Bratislava. But still, I hope to say some things about the research, about the exhibition, that Peter, to whom I'm very grateful for this invitation, asked me to present. Now I will start share screen with you. And now I will also be talking about the Southern Constellation, actually the series of exhibitions with the common name Southern Constellation, Poetics of the Non-Aligned. Precisely, I will talk about the concepts and the research behind those exhibitions, also showing some works and installation views. I will try to put the exhibitions and the researchers in the wider frame of topic of today's seminar, which is the archives and the political, social, and artistic imaginaries described in them. And when you mention care, I understand it as care for memory, the past, care for objects, heritage, as well as care for solidarity. And of course, all this also has to do with the Southern Constellation, with the heritage of the non-aligned. As I will try to point out, this was also one of the ideas behind the Southern Constellations exhibition, to activate archives into a tool for instigating social and political debates. So the first image, this is from Ljubljana's exhibition that happened in 2019. But let me explain in short the historical background of the non-aligned movement, even though I am quite sure that you probably know about this movement, but still. So this is the image from the first movement, from the first meeting, which happened between 1st and 6th September 61 in Belgrade. There were 25 representatives. As you can see in the image, they were all men, with the exception of Sirimalo Bandaranaike, Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. All men from 25 political diverse states gathered there. This was the first conference. Also, the acronym NAM is used for the non-aligned movement. So a grand event, a meeting, mostly former colonies from the global south and Yugoslavia. The conference was also an attempt to create a more alternative transnational political alliance, a third way between two blocks, aiming to change the existing global structure to create a more just, equal, peaceful world order. The movement also very early on declared itself as anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, following principles such as peaceful coexistence, respect for each other's territorial integrity, equality, and mutual benefit. Kwame Nkrumah, a president of Ghana, also present at this conference in Belgrade, he pointed out what seemed like the movement's essence. He said, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." The end of quote. The NAM has seen a revival of sorts in recent years. Of course, I'm not talking about the political movement itself, which still exists and has more members than ever before. Currently, the number is 120, but about this idea of the non-aligned, a kind of alternative or even parallel mondialization, the movement propagated from the beginning, a desire to create a more just, equal, and peaceful world order. After the initial years, the NAM transformed itself from being distinctly political to a movement with a strong economic and cultural agenda. In regard to the last, it was mainly concerned with cultural imperialism, restitution, and cultural exchanges. Interpreted from today's point of view, this quest also envisioned rewriting historical narratives, and the emphasis was put on altering epistemic colonialism and cultural dependency. So consequently, art and culture were primarily about politics and history, and an attempt to pluralize the experiences of modernity in the non-Western parts of the world. It seems the movement was aware of the fact that only this way it could enter the world's cultural space on equal footing. So the motto was to make the global South a place from which to speak. But the question that really interests me is this: why actually this fascination with the non-aligned movement? And I'd say that the reasons are many. Disillusions in the current global world order, especially rapid neo-liberal globalization, which has created huge problems, inequality, rise of new forms of economic and political dependency, the rise of right-wing politics, including historical revisionism, neo-colonialism, racism, and so on and so on. The NAM has been the topic of extensive researches, exhibitions, artworks in the cultural field too, especially in the last decade or so. As I mentioned, I have curated a series of Southern Constellations, the Poetics of the Non-Aligned exhibition, and the first one was in Ljubljana in Moderna galerija in 2019. Then last year it was the one in Gwangju, South Korea. This year it was in Rijeka in Croatia, but the exhibition is also going to be in a slightly different context in Ramallah in Palestine, in London, and in Skopje, all in 2022. So I think that these exhibitions are not exhibitions anymore, but what I think was the most important, they have produced a sort of Southern network of works, which now functions totally independent from the original exhibition that happened in Ljubljana. But nevertheless, the Southern Constellation exhibitions were a result of a really long research, a decade-long research. But since non-alignment is a huge topic, my interest, of course, was more specific. It was interest into cultural politics and the role art and culture play within the movement. And with the main research points, of course, the history of the non-aligned, the role of Yugoslavia in the movement, non-aligned cultural politics, and then a specific topic was Yugoslavia's cultural relations with the Third World. Important point was the dilemma of canons or cultural misunderstanding and contemporary, that is political, social, and artistic perspective. And the research was done as, of course, archival researches. These were archives in many archives in former Yugoslavia, in Slovenia, in Moderna galerija, archives of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, but also archives in, for example, Museo de la Solidaridad in Chile, in the National Archives in Ghana, and this example is from there, and the archives in Singapore. And then oral testimonies were very important, specifically with participants of the NAM summits, with curators of the exhibitions that happened under the auspices of the non-aligned, with historians, with artists, and then research of existing materials, books, magazines, even though I must say that a lot of these kind of materials were destroyed in Yugoslavia in the 90s when the political system changed. Of course, there were also research of the artworks that are still in various collections, mainly in former Yugoslavia. But I have also collaborated very closely with colleagues from different departments from our museum, that is Moderna galerija, but also with researchers and curators from around the world that were part of one or many projects within the Southern Constellation network. One important element within the non-aligned was also solidarity in culture. But within non-aligned, those solidarity cultural events did not, as it's sometimes thought, spontaneously come from below, but were organized at the highest state level, mainly through national art institutions, cultural attachés, and or committees for cultural exchanges with foreign countries. So cultural events, we could say, were actually diplomatic tools, and cultural influences were constantly negotiated depending on the political climates between two countries or between many countries within the movement. In case of Yugoslavia, it can be said that while its political manifesto of that time emphasized the grand ideas of anti-colonialism, decolonialism, and struggle against cultural imperialism, the practice tended to be somehow different. And to illustrate with one such example is that artworks from the Third World and the non-aligned countries were often considered, I'm talking about Yugoslavia, of course, were often considered ethnographics and shown in the ethnographic museums. And it took some decades before art from the Third World, or what is called art of the world, was discussed in terms of cultural and intellectual decolonialization, internationalism, parallel or local histories, and other kinds of modernities in the sphere of art and culture. And as I already mentioned, in Yugoslavia, there was a special committee established after the Second World War called the Committee for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, which arranged exhibition outside Yugoslavia's borders, so not only West and East, but also non-aligned countries. So Yugoslavia, for example, has signed agreements with 56 non-aligned members and observers. And these were some materials from those exhibitions. Various exhibitions were organized around the world. This one in Latin America. This one was the exhibition in India. But what I wanted to say that between the 60s and the 80s, many new biennials opened throughout the non-aligned world, signifying also this different kind of cultural exchange. For example, one was Biennial of Graphic Arts in Ljubljana. There was Triennial India in New Delhi, Coteher Art Biennial in Colombia, International Art Biennial in Valparaiso in Chile, then Asian Art Biennial in Bangladesh. So this is the drawing, and this is the image. Biennial of Art in Baghdad, Havana Biennial, and others. However, Yugoslavia had special relations with the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia already from the late 50s on. And President Tito often traveled to those countries on so-called journeys of peace. You can see here on this image. So journeys of peace were on a boat called Galep or Seagull. And particularly important was his 1961 trip to Western Africa. And this was the trip to support the independence of post-colonial states and also to discuss the upcoming first summit of the non-aligned. These travels, this is the boat, and these trips, of course, consequently acquired a strong economic dimension and created a new spheres of interest and exchange among the countries of the non-aligned movement. Intense economic collaboration at first included Yugoslav construction companies working on projects in Africa and the Middle East. And perhaps the biggest one was Energoprojekt construction company, which operated in 15 countries, designing and building infrastructure and buildings. And this is one example in Lusaka. And that's another, that's from the outside. And that is Lagos International Trade Fair in Nigeria. But what was particularly interesting is that the Yugoslav architect combined this specific let's say Yugoslav modernism with tropical modernism and also the local context. But why was this important was because it was the same time articulation of an idea and an attempt to show the world that is possible to direct one's own modernization process. So this research also based on archival materials was done by Dubravka Sekulic, and it was also shown in a series of the Southern Constellation exhibition. This particular setup is from the Ljubljana exhibition. And then, of course, the non-aligned also supported various national liberation struggles around the world, with Yugoslavia being the first European country to openly support the Algerian Liberation War. As a consequence, a request came from Algerian leadership. They asked for films about the Yugoslav partisan struggle during the Second World War, from which they could study the guerrilla tactics. And one of these cameramen was Stevan Labudovic, who was also later on Tito's cameraman, filming all sorts of NAM meetings, trips, and so on. And Stevan Labudovic was sent to Algeria for 3 years to film and to teach the Algerian people about how to make films. And Mila Turevic project at the exhibition was based on this kind of archival materials. And this is Stevan Labudovic in Algeria. So as you've seen, exchanges of all sorts happen in the fields of arts and education, that is between the non-aligned countries. Many students from non-aligned countries came to study in Yugoslavia. Also, museums acquired various artifacts, and some institutions even opened anew, such is the case of the Museum of African Art, opened in Belgrade in 1977 as a result of this ideological and political climate. But it's interesting that even though the predominant discourse of that time, of its establishment, was anti-colonial, but the methodologies and procedures dealing with the works of art were almost completely adopted from similar institutions or similar procedures in the West. However, this is the only anti-colonial museum of African art in Europe. Its collection was based on donations, and the largest one came from diplomats and journalists, Zdravko and Veda Pečar, who were active supporters of various liberation movements in Africa. So this is how the curators from Museum of African Art presented its museum and its collection and its methodologies in the Ljubljana Southern Constellation exhibition. But the earliest example of this non-aligned cultural exchanges in relation to Yugoslavia, of course, is the founding of International Exhibition of Graphic Prints in Ljubljana, in Moderna galerija, already in 1955. So the idea was to invite artists from all of the countries with which Yugoslavia had cultural or political relations, that is East, West, South, North, and of course the non-aligned countries, to establish contacts worldwide, to introduce abstraction into Yugoslav art, and of course to prove that even art can be an instrument of liberalization. And this way, Ljubljana Biennial of Graphic Arts was to be a practical example of Yugoslavia's cultural diplomacy and cultural policies of the non-aligned movement. So, and this is also how the Graphic Biennial was presented at the Southern Constellation exhibition in Ljubljana. In 1984, the Josip Broz Tito Gallery for the Art of the Non-Aligned Countries was inaugurated in what was then called Titograd, now it's called Podgorica in Yugoslavia, with the aim to collect, preserve, and present the arts and cultures of the non-aligned countries. And this was also the only art institution established directly under the auspices of the NAM. Of course, it has greater ideas to create a kind of triennial of arts from the non-aligned countries, study center, etc., etc. But of course, this has not happened because this collection and the museum closed in 1991 with the wars in Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And this collection is now part of the Center of Contemporary Art Montenegro. So these were only a few examples from Yugoslavia that were directly linked to the non-aligned culture and politics. And as you could see, there was a lot of the project and research is based particularly and specifically on the archival material. But one grant, if you can call it like this, exhibition under the NAM auspices happened in 1995 in Jakarta, and it was called Non-Aligned Nations Contemporary Art Exhibitions with 420 works by artists from 42 non-aligned countries, and the only European country present was Croatia. As you can see, this is a very strange map. This map is from the catalog of the exhibition. And this exhibition, still not much is known about it. And currently there are some groups of people there doing research on this. But nevertheless, there was at that time, that is 95, a lot of criticism of the exhibition in Indonesia, mainly because it was part of the government politics. And the Indonesian Suharto's government attitudes to freedom of expression in the mid-90s, of course, was under question at that time. The other was that the perspective that saw the concept of the exhibition as anti-West. It was a very important and interesting seminar that was also organized in the frame of this exhibition, where the participants, of course, again, from those non-aligned countries, they tried to argument their position versus Western art, discussing concepts such as Southern perspective in art and South as a place of change and solidarity. So taking all this, what I just said, into the wider context, the non-aligned transnational network did not produce a common tissue that would create a new international narrative in art. So Western canon might have been challenged to some degree, but with the exception of few, sometimes extreme cases, such as Zaire's L'Authenticité, the non-Western cultural expressions were usually interpreted in the frame of ethnology or traditional arts and crafts. And L'Authenticité, or with other words also called Mobutism, was a doctrine which aimed to erase all traces of Belgian colonialism in art and culture in Zaire, that's of course Congo, under Mobutu Sese Seko, who came to power in 1965 and renamed Congo to Zaire. But Mobutu Sese Seko was also kind of clever in this thinking how to promote l'authenticité. And this is especially this idea that he invited the ICA Congress to be organized there in 1973. And actually this was also the first time that the ICA Congress was happened on the African continent. So as for the non-aligned movement itself, since late 80s, it can be considered a kind of anachronism. It has not been able to provide any alternative plans for the either historical or current geopolitical and economic situation, and that has probably been one of its greatest weaknesses. It has not been able to provide any because structure and aspiration of its members has changed significantly. So even though the movement aims were from beginning progressive, there were many states in the non-aligned movement that were quite far from the principles the movement promoted. And most of the refugees coming to Europe in the past years are from the non-aligned countries that are currently at war or involved in some kind of armed conflict. Think of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and just currently Belarus. And the migrants that are on the border between Belarus and Poland are the migrants from the non-aligned countries. And what is, let's say, sad in a way, is because Belarus is also the member of the non-aligned movement, the only European country that is currently in the movement. So within this exhibition, Southern Constellation exhibition, there are also contemporary works that dealt with some of those contemporary aspects and perspectives, political, economic, social, that I just mentioned. And this is the work of Maria Berrios and Jakob Jakobsen that were exploring, this is the Ljubljana exhibition, they were exploring through a kind of pedagogical exhibition, the exhibition Del Tercer Mundo, which took place in Havana, Cuba in 1961. And this was one of the main events of the Cultural Congress of Havana, based on the international struggle against imperialism and towards the decolonization and liberation of the South. And then is the work with Ibro Hasanovic. This was a 10-day-long workshop working with the refugees, currently in Ljubljana, and then producing this work. Naim Mohammed's work based on 1973, Algeria conference, Algeria non-aligned conference was very particular because it has to do with oil crisis and third world debt crisis, which shifted the powers within the non-aligned movement. And this work, of course, talks about it from a contemporary perspective. And this is the work of Sven Augustinen, an installation based on a large collection of right-wing conservative Europe magazines. And the work also aims to trace the fate of the Belgian rifle FAL during the Cold War, as well as colonization, especially the case of Lumumba's killing in Congo, and etc. and so on. And these are also a couple of exhibition views from a recent exhibition in Rijeka in Croatia, which was the smallest exhibition of the three so far, even though the context was not small. It had a lot of content, a lot of material still. But of course, the question is, where are we at now? After years of research of the NAM's cultural politics, my focus lately shifted quite significantly. So while I believe it's extremely important to focus on the historical heritage of the non-aligned movement, I also believe that in the current political situation, and that's especially the case of our region, we should, in the next step, move the attention beyond the research based solely on the NAM's historical role, beyond the aspect of solidarity as once was to today's situation, and to propose a more radical cultural agenda that could be based, among other things, also on some of the NAM's emancipatory ideas. So this would need to be done on the level of governance, knowledge production, and heritage. But before we do that, we need to rethink the meaning of non-alignment, solidarity, humanism. For example, non-alignment in today's context could be easily understood as some kind of neutrality. And this, of course, is problematic. And lately, this has become quite an issue for many institutions around the world to openly support political causes, movements, various social issues, etc. This has been mainly due to the new right-wing conservative cultural politics, which demand art and culture institutions to be neutral. The same way, the idea, the concepts of solidarity has become overused and exhausted to some degree, associated mainly with the white savior complex and paternalist forms of assistance. So we must critically rethink with whom and how we are in solidarity, for whom solidarity actually brings change, and how it affects the already established order, not just perpetuate the status quo. With other words, we need to decolonize solidarity too. And also look at the solidarity, of course, from a wider perspective, including not only humans, but non-humans too, or more than humans into this debate as well. And I think, even though I have not directly touched it, but I think archives here also play an important role, as was probably, or you could see from the cases and examples that I just presented. So with this, I will conclude this presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. And I would also kindly ask you if you have any questions or comments about this particular research that we are doing and then that we are continuing to do. Please post your questions either to Peter or send them to me via email. Thank you very much, and goodbye from Ljubljana.